I've been working on building a custom audio player for a new podcast website that James Q. Quick and I are doing together called Compressed. Actually, go check it out. It's at compressed.fm, and I'll include a link in the description below. But on the site, you'll see the custom audio player in action. And while you're there, give our show a listen. It's all about web design and development. But today, I'm going to show you how I built the custom audio player. There's a little more complexity than I expected, and I had to cobble together a few resources in order to build it within React. I'm actually going to break this into a multi-part series. So in this video, we're going to put the basic blocks together, but in the future, I'll show you how to get multiple audio players on a page where playing one will stop another one, or how to add bookmarks and chapters, creating a link that jumps to a specific section of the episode, styling the player with a waveform image. See, there's fun content ahead. So be sure to hit the subscribe button below, or even better, hit the bell icon to receive notifications so you don't miss a thing. Let's do this. If you're new to the Self-Teach Me channel, my name is Amy Dutton. I'm a web designer and developer. If you're looking to get into this space, sometimes it's hard to know where to start or what resources to trust. I want to help you level up and get to where you want to be. So if this sounds interesting to you, hit the subscribe button below. Okay, last thing, before we jump in, I wanted to point out that this video is long. So if you didn't already notice, I've created timestamps listed in the description below. Feel free to jump around, or of course, watch this video in multiple sittings. Okay, first things first. First things first, second things second. Let's take a look at the design. I know I'm probably stating the obvious here, but this will be a list of all the elements that we need to build and everything that we need to account for. Let's take a look at this in Figma. So there's a play pause button. There's a jump back 30 seconds and a forward 30 seconds button. We have a play bar showing where we are in the song. And this should also work like any other play bar that you're used to seeing in iTunes or Spotify. You should be able to click on the bar to jump around the podcast or drag the knob to a specific point. Here we're displaying the current time code. On the opposite end, we have the duration. There's a lot here, so let's get started. As I mentioned, we're going to be building this within React. So I'm actually going to start with Next.js. If you're not familiar with Next.js, it's a React framework, but it gives us a nice starting point and installs React and gives us some scripts out of the box. In fact, I've gotten to the point where if I want to start a React project, I just reach for Next.js. I know React has Create React App, but Next.js is next level, making it so easy to set up custom routes and pages. So if we go to the Next.js site and click on Docs, and there's some information here about getting set up quickly. So we can just run npx or yarn inside the terminal. So I'm going to just copy this line. And for my terminal, I actually use Hyper. It's free, and I'll include a link in the description below. First, within the terminal, I need to navigate to my projects folder. So the easiest way to do this is actually to type CD and then to find where you need to go within the Finder and just drag and drop your folder over. And now I can just hit enter, and I'm going to paste that line that we copied from the Next.js docs. And the first thing is it's going to ask me what I want to name my project. So I'm going to call this audio player, and it'll take a hot minute to load that up. That is taking a very hot minute. Perfect. Now that the scripts have run, your screen should look similar to mine. Next.js gives us a few scripts that we can run. I'm going to take their recommendation here at the bottom, and I can navigate to our new audio player folder by copying this line. And now I want to run our project, so I'm just going to copy and paste. Perfect. Now our server is successfully up and running, so we can click on this link inside Hyper, and it will pull up a browser, and you should see something like this. Let's open up our project within VS Code. If you've never used Next.js before, it's totally okay. We're not going to go into too much detail here, but it's actually pretty simple. Anything within the Pages folder is a route or a URL or a page, or however you want to think about it. So within Next.js, I can create a new page by just adding a new file to this folder, say about.js. And now all the content in this file will be available at my site /about. Very easy. If we kind of walk through the Pages folder, you'll see that there's already a few files and folders in there. For now, let's just delete this About file. If we look at a little bit more detail at our pages directory, you'll see that there's already a few files and folders loaded in. We have our underscore app.js file, and this is the app's default setting. So you can think of this as the main app element. And I'll typically include different context providers here, or authentication, or my global styles. The API folder is perfect for creating an API or server-side functions for your application. We won't be doing any of that today, so I'm just going to leave that alone. The index.js file is our homepage. So if we look at this file, you'll see all the code for the next.js splash page within our browser. And this was this page that we were looking at. Okay, so for now, let's clear this out. And I'm going to delete everything inside our main element. And I'm going to type audio player just as some placeholder text. Now I'm going to delete our footer, and I'm going to give that a save. So the import head statement at the top allows us to access the HTML head element and inject our metadata. And this is part of the Next framework. So if you look at the code at the top of the component, you can see where we're using the head component to add a title tag and a link to a favicon. So I'm going to change our title tag to React Audio Player and give that a save. For styling, Next.js comes with CSS modules out of the box. And honestly, I prefer style components, but in this video, I really just want to focus on building the audio player. So I'm going to use what we already have. Within the styles folder, there are a couple of CSS files for styling. We have the globals.css file, which includes, global styles. If we look at this a little closer, you can see that it's removing the default margin and padding and setting up a default font and some basic link styling. The asterisk block means that this style gets applied to every single element on the page. The box sizing border box property actually changes how the browser handles the box model. It just means that when you define the width for an element, that number includes padding instead of tacking it on at the end. This just makes things a little bit more predictable and easier to calculate. If this is confusing to you, don't worry about it. It's not really going to affect us today, but I'll include a link in the description below to some additional information if you want to dive in a little bit deeper. If I open up the home.module.css file that it's referencing here at the top of our index.js file, you can see that these are styles that format all the content on the home page. But real quick, I'm going to pull this panel up side by side with the home page code and hide our sidebar. I just want to point out exactly how this works. So our CSS file looks pretty normal, just regular plain Jane CSS. At the top of index.js, we're importing our styles. Then anytime we want to reference a specific class within our React component, we're calling curly brackets styles dot the name of our class. So this first div is referencing the container class within our CSS. Our main element has a class of styles.main on it, and that references the main class within our CSS. Pretty straightforward, right? So I'm going to clean out this CSS file and delete everything except the container and main blocks. Okay, cool. So if we look at this real quick within our browser, we should have our audio player text centered. Great. So with that piece in place, let's get to the meat.
Arby's, we have the meat.
In the root of our project, I'm going to create a components directory. So you can just click on this folder icon and type components. And inside, I'm going to create a file called audioplayer.js. So far, so good. Within this file, within our new audio player file, I'm going to type RAFCE and hit enter. And this stubs out our boilerplate code. Magic, right? Well, within VS Code, I have an extension running called ES7 React Redux GraphQL React Native Snippets. I know, the longest title ever. But I'll include a link in the description below, but this is great for stubbing out components and boilerplate code, just like we did. Let's move our audio player text from our index.js file into our audio player file. So I'm going to copy this and I'm going to paste this into our component. And while we're here, I also want to change this from a default export to a named export. You can do that by wrapping our component name in curly brackets. This is just a personal preference, but I like for all of my exports to be named exports. And this just keeps things nice and clean and consistent because I always know that my components are named exports. Let's go back to our index.js file and import our new component from. Now let's display our audio player. So where the audio player text is, I'm going to swap this out for our component. So give that a save. Okay, now if we head over to the browser, it should look the exact same as it did before. Wonderful. Back in VS Code, I'm going to close my index.js file and my CSS file. And almost everything that we're going to do now is going to be within our audioplayer.js. So let's stub out all the elements that we're going to need. Within our components div, let's get rid of this text and let's add the actual audio. So we're going to use a standard HTML audio tag. And actually, let's pull up the audio documentation on the W3 Schools website. Okay, first I want to point out that there are 3 different audio pages on the site, and I know that might be a little confusing, so let's walk through all of them. Plus, that will give us a good understanding of how our audio player actually works. If you look at the sidebar, there's an HTML media section, and below that we have our HTML audio element, and this is for the browser's default audio player. So I'm going to click on the Try It Yourself button. And it will appear in a second window with that code. Okay, so you can see that the HTML is on one side and the browser's audio player is on the other side. Cool. So we have our main audio element, and that wraps several different file types, letting the browser determine which type it wants to use. So let's go over to the sidebar and scroll down to the HTML reference section, and we want to click on this HTML audio video page. So before we were looking at the HTML item, and this is the DOM reference. This might be a little confusing because a lot of times DOM looks just like HTML, but DOM stands for Document Object Model. So when a web page is loaded, the browser actually creates this tree of objects. But the DOM allows us to get, change, or delete these HTML elements. So let me explain this in a slightly different way. Say you're building a website using JavaScript and you go to the view source code, and the source code looks slightly different than if you just pulled up in your developer tools and inspected the element. Well, your developer tools are rendering the DOM, and that's what we're talking about. It reflects how JavaScript has changed and deleted those HTML elements. So back to W3 Schools and what that means for us. This DOM reference shows us what methods and properties we can access within JavaScript. So if we give this a quick skim, the DOM reference shows us what methods and properties we can access within JavaScript. If we give this a quick skim, you'll see that there's a play and pause. If we scroll down a little bit further, there's a current time property that allows us to set or return the current playback position. There's a duration property that returns the length of the current audio or video file in seconds. So already with those 4 different methods, I've listed everything that we need to build the player that we just stubbed out. Before we jump over to our code though, I do want to point out the audio HTML element in the sidebar. And this is basically what we're looking at on the first page, but in a little bit more detail. So let's see right here. On this page, it tells us exactly what attributes we have access to on our audio tag. So if we scroll down, you'll see that there's a table here, and we want to pay special attention to the last 2 attributes, the preload and source. So we're going to use preload to get all the metadata. And instead of using individual source tags, we're going to specify the URL of the audio player directly on the audio tag. Okay, I know this has been a lot of talking, but I just want to make sure you understand exactly what you're doing and why. This is not just a copy and paste job. Okay, VS Code. On the source attribute on our audio tag, I'm going to send it a audio file. And we're hosting our podcast on Simplecast, so I'm going to use their URL. But if you're hosting this somewhere else, say Amazon S3, you put that URL here. Then, as I mentioned, we're going to use the preload attribute, and I'm going to give it a value of metadata. Now let's display all the buttons and components that we need. So we want a button to be able to jump back 30 seconds. Then we want a button to be able to toggle between playing and pausing. Then we want another button that will let us jump forward 30 seconds. Okay, cool. Next up, let's display the current time for the clip that we're currently on. So right now I'll just say 0 zeros. Then we'll also need to display the duration. And let's just give this 249 for right now. Then in between our current time and our duration, we want to display our progress bar. And fortunately for us, HTML has a built-in range component or a slider. And you've probably seen this before on forms where you need to pick a number within a certain range. So I'm going to wrap this in a div and say input type range. Okay, if we open this within a browser, you'll see all of our components are there. Looks terrible, but everything is there. Okay, so let's handle the styling. Then our styles folder, let's create a new file and we'll call this audioplayer.module.css. Now let's link it up within our component. So in our audioplayer.js at the top, I'll say import styles from styles audioplayer.module.css. Perf. Okay, let's get this in split view to make it a little bit easier to go back and forth. Okay, I'm going to create a class called audioplayer, and this will sit on our main element. So I'm going to say class name equals styles.audioplayer. Make sure that has a little a. Let's use flexbox to get all of these items in line. So I'm going to say display flex, and I'll give it a width of 700 pixels. There's a few icons I want to use, arrows for forward and back, and a play pause icon. Normally I would probably make these custom SVGs, but here I want to move quickly, so I'm just going to install React icons. This is actually a great library that pulls icons from several different libraries. Bootstrap, Devicons, Font Awesome, Icomoon, Material Design. I'm missing a bunch, but you can select which icon you want and only import that single icon. You're not importing the entire library. So within the terminal, I'm going to stop our server by hitting Control-C. Now let's say npm install React icons. Now let's get our server back up and running. So I'm going to say npm run dev. I'm going to pull up the React icons documentation, and on the left you can see all the libraries that it's pulling from. I'm going to search across all of them for an arrow, and I like this short stubby one. If I click on the icon, it will actually copy the name to my clipboard. So back in VS Code, I'm going to import our icon into our audio player. So I'm going to say import curly brackets and paste our icon name in. I'm going to pull this from React icons, and then we need to tell it which package we're pulling it from. So the trick here is that if you look at the icon name, it's prefixed with the package name. So for this one, it's BS for Bootstrap. So you just type in BS. Now within our code, I'm going to swap out the word back for our icon, and this looks just like a normal component. Okay, we also need a right arrow, so I'm going to duplicate our import and change left to right, and then I'm going to do the same thing for forward, except I want it to be on the other side. Okay, we also need a play button, so I'm going to go back to our React icon documentation, and I'm going to search for play. And I like this play button from the Font Awesome library. You can see it says FA. So same as before, I'm going to click on the image to copy it. And then in VS Code, I'm going to add it to our list of imports here at the top. Except this time, I'm going to say from FA. And I'm going to do the same thing for our pause icon. And I want to use the Font Awesome pause button so that everything matches. So I'm going to duplicate this line and change that to FA pause. Okay, sweet. Now the play pause button we want to swap out depending on our state. So if the player is playing, we need the ability to pause. Or if it's stopped or paused, we need to show the play button. So we need to pull in React's useState to keep track. At the top of our imports, we're already importing React. So I'm going to say comma and let's add useState to the list. Then above our return statement, our component, let's add useState. The way this works is we're just structuring an array. So the first value is the name of the state. We're just going to make up this name. This is going to hold a true or false value. And anytime I'm working with Booleans, which is a true false value, I like to say is whatever. So is it playing? True. So I'll just say is playing. And the second value, so put this in square brackets because this is an array. The second value is a function, and this is how we update isPlaying. So the naming convention here is to use the same name as our variable, isPlaying, but we prepend it with the word set. So we say set isPlaying. Okay, perfect. And we can pass a default value to useState. So by default, when the page loads, we don't want our player to play automatically. So we'll tell it false. Okay, now within our button, we can replace the text with our icons. So here we have our play pause, and I'm going to use a conditional. So I'm going to say if it's playing, so if that's true, we want it to display our pause button. But if it's false, then we want to display a play button. Okay, let's give that a save. If we flip over to the browser, we can see our icons. We need to be able to toggle between these two options so we can set up an on-click event. So on our button code right here, we'll say on-click, and then we can just make up a name for our function. So I'm going to call this toggle play pause. So now right above our return statement, let's define this. So I'm going to say const, and we're going to call our function name. And we want to update our isPlaying by using the set isPlaying function. And we just want it to be the opposite of whatever isPlaying is. So if isPlaying is true, this will set it to false. If isPlaying is false, this will set it to true. Okay, let's jump over to our browser and test it out. So if we click on our play button, it turns to pause. If we click on our pause button, it turns to play. Easy peasy lemon squeezy. Okay, now got a little distracted from our styling, so let's go back and wrap that up. For the backward and forward 30, I'm going to style these similarly. In my CSS, so this audioplayer.module.css file, let's create a class called forward backward. And I'm going to stick a class name attribute on our buttons. So we'll say class name styles forward backward. Within our CSS, let's remove the default background and border. And the arrows were not quite centered, so let's use Flexbox to knock these pieces into line. So we'll say display flex and align items center. That'll make everything centered vertically. Let's change the font family to monospace and make it a little bit bigger. I also want to see the cursor change into a pointer when I hover over the button. Okay, for our hover state, let's add some more styles. So I'm going to say forward, backward, and then I'm going to use the pseudo element hover to grab that hover state, and I want to change the color, and I want to make it pink, but instead of hard coding in a value, let's save it inside a CSS variable to make our life just a little bit easier. So remember, our audio player class wraps our entire component. So I can define a variable here, and it will be accessible to all of the elements inside. To create a variable, I'm going to use double dashes, and I'm going to call this primary, since this will be our primary color, but it could be anything. And then I'm going to paste in my hexadecimal value for pink. Within my hover state, I can use that variable by saying var, so it knows I'm pulling in a variable. And I'm going to use those double dashes and refer to primary. If we check this within the browser, we hover over this, this is looking good. Now let's move over to our play button. So let's create a class called play pause, and we want to add that class to our button. Give that a save. Now within our styles, I'm going to change the background color to our pink color, and I'm going to remove the default border that we get on all of our buttons. Then I want this to be a circle, so I'm going to say border radius is 50%. I'm going to give it a width of 75 pixels and a height of 75 pixels. want the icon to be just a little bit bigger. So I'm going to say font size is 32 pixels. And then I want the icon to have color of yellow. So I'm going to create another variable here at the top of my file and call this secondary. To paste in a yellow hexadecimal color. Now here at the bottom, I can say color. And just like with pink, I can reference it, except this time I'm going to call secondary. And let's go back over to our browser and give this a look. Cool. So icon isn't exactly centered. So let's reach for Flexbox again. And I want to center it horizontally. So I'm going to say justify content center. I'm going to center it vertically. So I'm going to say align items center. Give that a save. If we go back and look, it's getting a little bit closer, but if we click on the button, the pause button looks perfectly centered, and technically the play button is perfectly centered too, but optically it's not. It's heavy on the left side. So let's shift it just a little bit. So I'm going to add a class of play to the play icon itself. And within our styles, let's make sure that we are positioning it relative. I'm going to say left 5 pixels. Okay, much better. Okay, we're getting there, but let's knock all of our elements in line vertically. If we go back to our audio player class, this wraps everything, and we already have a display of flex applied, but let's apply align items center. Give that a save and back to the browser. Much better. Okay, let's style the current time and duration next. Within our component, let's add a class name of current time. And on our duration, let's add one for duration. Now at the bottom, we can add style blocks for these. So say current time and duration. We can just style both of these at the same time. So I'm going to say font family is monospace, and we'll make the font size 16 pixels. Let's look at this. Now I want to give just a little bit of spacing between the forward 30 button and the current time. So I'm going to add just a little bit more CSS. So let's say current time, margin left is 25 pixels. Phew. Okay, let's move on to our progress bar. And this piece is going to be a little crazy because every browser handles this component differently. There's a great article on CSS Tricks that explains how to style this. And I'll stick a link in the description below for reference. All right, buckle up and hang on. We need to style our input range. And normally I would probably do something like this. But with CSS modules, you have to use a class name or an ID. So let's use progress bar as our class name, and we want to add it to our component. The easiest way to do this is to create a few CSS variables. A few of these items we're going to style 3 times. Once for Chrome, once for Safari, and once for Firefox. And it will feel a lot like repeat. But if we keep these properties in CSS variables, we change it once in one place and everything stays in sync. In VS Code, let's create variables for all the properties that we're going to keep track of. And remember, variables are scope, so it's important where you actually list your variables. So since these are applying just to our progress bar, I'm going to list them inside this class. So the first one I'm going to name is bar background, and this is the default progress bar background color. And I'm going to set this to a light shade of pink. So I'm going to paste in that hex value. Then let's do the seek before width. And let's set this to 100 pixels. And this is the part of the bar that appears before the scrubby handle or the knobby. Then let's say seek before color. And this is the color of the bar before the handle. So we already put the width inside the variable above, but this is the actual color. So let's make it a darker shade of that light pink. So paste in that hex value. Then we have our knobby, and this is the color of our knob or our progress handle or our playhead, whatever you want to call it. So let's set this to a blue purplish color. So I'll paste in that hex value. And then let's do one for our selected knobby. And this is the color of the knob once we've grabbed it and it's selected. So this will be turquoise. Let's put these variables to good use. So I'm going to move my code up, and we want to hide the default background color of our range slider. So I'm going to say appearance is none. I'm going to set the background using the variable that we've already created. So say background var BG, and I want it to have rounded corners. So I'm going to say border radius is 10 pixels. I want to make the position relative, and I want to give it a width of 100% and a height of 11 pixels. And I want to remove the default outline by setting that to none. Okay, now we need to basically set the exact same properties that we set for Chrome except for Safari. So I'm going to say progress bar, and let's leave ourselves a little comment here so we know these are for Safari. So to target it for Safari, we need to use a special pseudo element. So we'll say progress bar double colons WebKit slider runnable track. And we can actually copy all the styles that we wrote for Chrome except the appearance property and give that a paste. Then we want to do the exact same thing for Firefox. So let's give ourselves a little comment here. Firefox. Firefox has its own custom pseudo property. So let's call that, it is Moz range track. And we can paste those exact same properties over again. Now let's add one more piece for Firefox. To remove the outline, we actually need to target one of its special pseudo elements. So we'll say progress bar, Moz focus outer. And set this to border 0. Next, we need to set up the progress bar background color. And this is the part that will appear before the knob. So if we're dragging this handle around, this is the part that we've already played, and it will be a different color than the remaining audio. So back in VS Code, let's style this for Chrome first. So I'm going to say progress bar, and these styles will actually work for Safari as well. So let's add that to our comment. And in order to get this to work, we are going to use our pseudo element before, so that we're injecting this element before our progress bar. And when you're using a before, in order to get the tag to show up, you have to use the content property. And we can just use blank quotes to leave that empty. Next, we want to give this a height of 11 pixels. Then our width, we want to be dynamic, and we've actually already set up a variable for that called seek before width. We want to change the background color, and we have a variable for that as well called seek before color. Then for our corners, we want the corners on the left to be rounded to line up with our progress bar, but the edge on the right can be straight. That's the part that appears underneath the knob. So in order to target those corners individually, we can say border left, top left radius, and we can make that 10 pixels, and border bottom left radius, and we'll set that to 10 pixels. We want to position this absolutely. And we can say top is 0, left is 0. And we want to make sure that this appears above our progress bar, so we can set the Z index to 2. And when the user hovers over the bar, we want the cursor to change to a pointer. So let's give this a save and check this out within Chrome. Awesome. It is coming together. Okay, onward and upward to Firefox. So say progress bar, Firefox. Again, we have our comment, and Firefox has its own special pseudo element. So we'll call progress bar, and this is Moz range progress. And let's set our background color to our pseudo element. Seek before color. Perfect. And then let's set the border radius just like we did for Chrome above. So we can actually give that a copy and a paste. And we can also set the height to 11 pixels. Now for the knob, let's start with Chrome and Safari. So say Knobby, Chrome and Safari. We'll grab the progress bar, and we have a special pseudo element here called WebKit slider thumb. And we got our comment. Okay, so let's remove the default styling. So I'm going to say WebKit appearance none. Then we just want this to be a circle. So let's give this a height of 15 pixels and a width of 15 pixels. To give it those rounded edges, we need to say border radius is 50%. Let's remove the border by setting it to none. And then we can use our custom variable we already set up for our background color, and we want that to be our knobby. Okay, so when the user hovers over the knob, we want to change the cursor to a pointer. So we can say cursor is pointer. Then we want to move it up slightly. So we'll say position is relative, and we want to give it a margin of -2 pixels just to bump it up a little bit on the top. And we can say zeros for the other sides. We want this to appear on top of the progress bar and the played part. So we'll set our Z index to 3. And then let's change our box sizing to border box, which is the initial default value. Okay, now when we drag the knob, let's change the background color of the knob and make it just a little bit bigger. So in order to do that, we'll say progress bar active, and we want to grab that WebKit slider thumb. Let's add our comment up here. Knobby while dragging for Chrome and Safari. Okay, let's pull this up. We want to set transform so it'll get just a little bit bigger, and we want to set our background to our selected knobby color. Now Firefox. We'll get there. Okay, so let's set up our comment. This is the knobby for Firefox. Let's grab our progress bar, and we're going to use a special Firefox pseudo element called Mo's range thumb. Let's give ourselves a head start by just copying and pasting the knobby styles from our Chrome and Safari block. And I do want to change a few things here. Notice I didn't grab the WebKit appearance since that's specifically for Chrome and Safari. We can remove this margin because Firefox actually places this correctly out of the box. And then instead of setting our border to none, let's set this to transparent. When it's selected in Firefox, let's go ahead and grab this, except we want to add our active pseudo element. And just like before, we want it to transform it and change the background color. I'm going to add my comment. Okay, let's give this a save and check it in all of our browsers. So in Chrome, when we're grabbing this, perfect. Now in Firefox, okay, perfect. And then in Safari, awesome sauce. Okay, great. Now for the fun part, if you weren't having fun already, the interaction. So let's use JavaScript to interact with our player. And since we already have the beginnings of our play pause, let's start there. In order to make it easy to grab our audio player, let's set up a reference. And this is a piece that's built directly into React. So at the top of our file where we're importing useState, let's also import useRef. Then right below our state, and I'm actually going to add a quick comment here right above our state so we can keep things nice and documented. Some people try to avoid comments at all costs and believe the code should be self-documenting, and that might be true, but man, I think you can get there a heck of a lot faster and understand exactly what the code is doing and why I coded a certain way if you leave comments. I like to believe that this is coding with empathy. It's being kind to other developers that might need to work within your code base. And even if you're working alone, you're still being kind to your future self. So trust me, you won't remember what you did 6 months from now. Okay, so for our reference, right below our state, I'm going to add our references. And the way this works is we want to set up a variable that we can, reference. So I'm going to call ours audio player. And then we're going to say that this is a reference. So we'll say useRef. And I'm going to make sure that we remember in the future that this is for our audio component. Now we actually need to connect it to our audio player. So if we scroll down to our HTML audio element, I'm going to add ref equals audio player. And we're using curly brackets here because this is JavaScript. Now within our toggle play pause function, let's add a conditional. So we can say if, and the name of our state is playing. Then we want to reference our audio player. And it stores a whole bunch of data related to our player. In this case, we want to grab the current element and play. Again, this play function is available to us as an HTML DOM element. So I'll pull up the W3 Schools documentation again real quick. You can see we have this method play. And there's another one for pause, which is exactly what we'll need for our else statement. So let's add that. So I'm going to say else audio player.current stop pause. Okay, now let's open this up within our browser. Close that, hit refresh. Okay, this is really strange. If we click once, nothing happens. We click again and it starts playing. But then our toggle state is backwards. Believe it or not, I set us up for failure on purpose. So use state is asynchronous. So when we update our toggle button by saying set is playing to the opposite, it runs out and executes that function. It doesn't have time to get back before we run our conditional. So the correct way to write this code is to grab the previous value. With use state, you can grab the previous value. So I could say set is playing. I'm going to grab the previous value and set it to the opposite. The only problem here is that this still doesn't solve our asynchronous issue. We need the previous value within that condition. So let's actually just pull it out and give it its own variable name. So say const prev value, and we want to set that to whatever is the current is playing. Then within our state, let's set that to the opposite. And now let's run our conditional. So we'll say prev value because that's our new state. Okay, let's pull this up within our browser. Give this a refresh. And everything seems to be working like a champ. Okay, now let's connect the duration of our track. This should actually be pretty easy since there's a duration property, just like there was a play pause method. So the first thing we need to do is let's create a piece of state to hold our value at the top. So I'm going to say const duration, and we want to update it using the set duration method. Say use state. And we can set the default here by passing it a value of 0. Now we can jump down to our JSX and we have a comment here for duration. See how helpful these comments are? And let's swap out our hard-coded 249 for duration. If we give that a save and we open it up within the browser, you should see a 0. Okay, perfect. Cool. Now let's update it to the correct value based on our audio file. And we want this to figure it out once since it won't change. So in order to do that, we can use React's useEffect. So at the top of our file, let's import useEffect. Then we want to use our useEffect hooks at the top of our component right below our state and reference declaration. So we'll say useEffect. So the way this works is it takes a function as the first parameter and an array as the second parameter. The function is whatever you want it to do. So that's where we'll set the duration, and the array tells it when we want it to run useEffect. If we don't pass it an array, it will run every single time the component refreshes. If you pass it an empty array, it will only run once when the component first loads. It may seem like we only want it to run once when the component first loads, but the problem is our audio file may or may not have loaded yet. So let's tell it to run as soon as the audio player has loaded and its metadata or when the audio player is ready. So in the array, we'll say if the audio player exists, we can add a question mark to say if audio player exists, and if current exists, and we want it to update when the loaded metadata is available. Okay, and again, loaded metadata is available just like play, pause, and duration. Okay, we want to do the same thing for our ready state. So we'll say audio player question, current question, ready state. Now let's write the function that we want it to run. We want to update our state. So we'll say set duration, and we want it to be set to the audio player and its duration. If we look at this within the browser, the only problem is that it's within seconds with a decimal. Okay, so let's jump back over to our code. And JavaScript has a built-in function called floor that will allow us to round down. So let's abstract this a little bit to make it easier to read. I'm going to create a variable called seconds, and then we'll call JavaScript's round function math.floor. And we want to pass it our audio's duration. So I'm going to cut that and paste that into our function. And now we want to set our set duration to seconds. So if I give this a save, and if we come back over, we got rid of the decimal, but the only problem is that it's still not formatted correctly. So let's write a separate function to reformat our data. So let's call this calculate time. And this is going to be a new function. Okay, and we're going to pass in our seconds. First, let's figure out how many whole minutes this translates into. So I'm going to create a variable called minutes, and we can just divide the number of seconds by 60. But to get rid of the decimal place, we again need to wrap this in math.floor. Perfect. Okay, if our minutes is less than 10, then we want to stick a 0 in front. So let's create another variable to hold this called const returned minutes. And we want to say if our minutes is less than 10, then we want to return our minutes with a 0 in front. Otherwise, we can just simply display minutes as is. If this 0 minutes format looks funny to you, it's the same thing as writing 0 plus minutes, but it's a little bit more succinct. So the backticks let us use JavaScript inline, and the $sign and curly brackets let the compiler know that we're passing in a JavaScript variable. Okay, now we need to determine how many seconds. So let's stick that inside a variable too. So I'll say const seconds. And here we can use seconds since the seconds we passed in above is just secs, S-E-C-S. Okay, JavaScript has a math operator called a modulus, and it returns the remainder. So we want to divide our seconds by 60 again, but we only want the minutes. We want to determine whatever is left over. So instead of using the divide, we'll use the percent sign. That's the modulus. Okay, and we want to round this down too. So say math.floor and wrap that. Just like returned minutes, let's create a variable called returned seconds. And we'll say if our seconds is less than 10, we want to put a 0 in front of it. Otherwise, we can just return the seconds as is. Okay, now let's stitch our returned minutes and our returned seconds. And we just want them to be separated by a colon. So we'll say returned minutes, returned seconds. And we'll wrap this with backticks. Within our JSX, let's jump down to where we are listing our, let me fix this misspelling real quick. Let's jump down to where we're displaying our duration in our JSX, and let's wrap this with our new function. Okay, and if we head over to the browser, you'll see that it's displaying our time just like we wanted. And we can actually get rid of those spaces. Give that a save. Perfect. Okay, occasionally you might see NaN, which means not a number. And this is displaying because it's trying to display the duration before it's ready. So let's add a conditional within our JSX. So first we want to check that the duration exists. So we're going to use the double ampersands. And we also want to see if the duration is not a number. So we can use a JavaScript function to see if it is not a number. We'll pass it duration, but we're checking for the opposite. We only want it to run if it's not true. And let's wrap this in parentheses so it'll check for both of those items. Okay, cool. Now, while we're at it, let's display the current position. So just like duration, let's add some state to keep track of our current time. So if I come back up here to the top, let's add a new variable for current time. And our update function is going to be set current time. Make sure we're using useState. And let's set the default to 0 so that it's always at the beginning. Okay, if we go down to our JSX where we're displaying the current time, right here we have our comment. Let's swap it out for our dynamic value. So I can say current time. And then just like duration, we want it to be formatted correctly. So we'll reuse our calculate time function and pass it that current time value. Okay, so if we check this within the browser, it says 00, which is perfect. Okay, so next, our progress bar. Okay, on the range element, let's set the default value to 0. And if you remember, we're setting our played styles with a width inside our CSS. So let's update our custom variable to match the default value so that everything stays in sync. So over here in our styles, we want to set this to 0. Okay, let's check this within the browser really quick just to make sure that everything is displaying correctly. Perfect. Now we want the progress bar to track along as the song plays. Right now, our range slider is a range of 0 to 100, but really it should be 0 to however many seconds are in the song. And then increasing the input's value, say 30, will advance the song 30 seconds. Let's set up another reference to make it easier to latch onto our progress bar. So at the top, we have our reference to our audio player. Let's also set one up for our progress bar. So I'm going to say const progress bar equals useRef. And let's set up a quick comment so we can remember this is a reference to our progress bar. And then we need to attach it to our input. So down here where we have our progress bar range, we can hide these for right now. We'll say ref is our progress bar. Now let's jump back up to our use effect where we determine the duration, and we'll set the max amount on our progress bar to match the duration. So let's grab our progress bar reference and the current item, and we'll set the max property to seconds. And that seconds is coming from the variable that we set above. Remember, current is referencing the current item in our reference, and max is a built-in property on our input range. Now, when we change the range slider, we want to update where we are in the song. So let's add an onChange event to our range slider. Scroll back down. We'll say onChange. And let's have it run a function called change range. Now let's actually go write that function. So I'll come back up here right above my return statement, and we'll say const change range. Let's make sure we spell this correctly. Perfect. And we can grab the current time from our audio player. So again, that's one of those built-in functions. So I'm going to say audio player dot current. Since we're referencing the current item on our audio player reference, we want to grab the current time. Remember, that's one of those properties that's on our audio element, and we want it to be equal to the current value of our progress bar. So I'll say progress bar dot current dot value. Then we also need to update our CSS variable to match, and we can do all of this within JavaScript. So let's grab our progress bar, just like we've been doing. So we'll say dot current, and then we can grab the style. So we'll say style. We want to set the property, since this was a CSS property that we created, and the first parameter that it takes is in the name of our variable. So we'll say seek before width. And the second parameter is the value. So we're going to use JavaScript to calculate a percentage and build out the string. So I'm going to use backticks, and we want to create a percentage to say that something like 25% of the song has been played. So to figure that out, we'll take the current song, progress bar.current.value, and we'll divide it by the duration. And remember, duration is stored in our state, And then let's multiply it by 100. And since we're using this value in CSS, we need to tack on the percentage sign at the end. We want to make sure that when we change the knobby, it also updates the current time readout next to the progress bar. So we can set the current time to update it. So we'll pass that the progress bar.current.value. Okay, if we look at this within the browser, oh brother, change range is not defined. So I misspelled that. No big deal. Okay, give that a save. Come back over to the browser, drag our knobby around. The played style moves around like we wanted, and the current time updates as well. If we play our song and we click around,
I don't know code. Not sure I
you'll see that the song jumps around too. Woohoo! Now we just need to set it up so that when it's playing, the knobby moves too. The first time I built this for the compressed.fm site, I wanted to reach for useEffect to update the knob. useEffect would run every time the React component refreshes, but that didn't work because useEffect doesn't update every second and it's unpredictable about when it chooses to update. So in the process of doing research, I discovered a built-in JavaScript function called requestAnimationFrame. Let me explain how it works. Typically, when you want to run a function, say every second in JavaScript, you might reach for something like setInterval. I know I've used this for timers in the past, but you can give setInterval a name and tell it to start and stop. Well, requestAnimationFrame works almost the exact same way. You can name it, telling it when to start and stop, but in this case, you're telling the browser that you have an animation you want to run before the next repaint, which is actually what I thought useEffect did, but doesn't. In the code to set this up, let's create another reference. That's right, we can set references to more things than just DOM elements. So back in our code at the top of our file where we declare our references, let's create a variable called animationRef. And we want to use useRef. And let's add a comment here. This will reference the animation that we're working on. Now we want to set up our reference as soon as we hit play. And then we want to cancel the animation when we hit pause. So let's go to our toggle play pause function. And as soon as we set it to play, here, let's set up a new line and reference our animation. So we'll say animationRef.current, and this should equal requestAnimationFrame. And we need to pass this a function. And remember, requestAnimationFrame is a JavaScript function that we get out of the box. So I'll call this while playing. And we haven't written that function yet, but we will. But you could name this function anything that you like. Okay, and then in our else conditional, where we pause, let's call our JavaScript function to stop our animation. So we'll say cancel animation frame. Again, that's a JavaScript function that we get out of the box, and we want to pass it that reference. So we'll say animationRef.current. Okay, cool. Now let's write our while playing function. So let's come down a few lines here, and we'll say const while playing. And now every frame, we want to update the range slider to match the current time. And remember, we can grab that with a reference. We have our progress bar dot current, and we want the value to be equal to the audio. And we have a reference for that. See, these references are helpful. We have audio player dot current, and we need the current time method. And the current time method is built into HTML. Next up, we need to update our CSS property. And we already did this once in our change range function. So let's copy that. It's down here. And we're going to paste that into our while playing function. Okay, now we need to update the current time in our state to match the range slider. So we've actually already written this as well. And let's paste that in. And I do want to take a hot minute and point out that there's a little bit of redundancy here. So if you look at the change range function, it looks pretty similar. So we could abstract these bottom two lines and put them in its own function. But I did want to point out that this top line is different. They're backwards. In the change range method, we're updating the range slider and telling the audio player to jump to wherever the range slider is. In our while playing function, the audio player is playing and we want the range slider to match up with that. Let's pull this out because we're actually going to reference it again later. So I'm going to create a new function called const change player current time. We'll stub out our function. Oops. Okay. And let's grab these two lines. And we can replace that with our function. Actually, I can grab this and hit Command D and it'll select the next instance of it. And I'm going to replace that. Perfect. I'll do this a lot while I'm programming. I'll write a function, notice duplication, and then abstract it. Every time you feel deja vu, like I've already done this once, that's a good indicator that you can pull this out into its own function. Now we need to do one more thing in our while playing function. As it is right now, this function will only run once, and we want it to keep running until we tell it to stop when we hit pause. So in order for it to run again, we need to tell it to call itself. We can actually just use the same line from our play conditional. If we come up here, and we'll paste that into our function. So just to review, it gets to the end of the function and it says, hey, when you repaint, call while playing again. And since we're still assigning it to the animation ref that we set up, pausing it will stop it. Phew. For me, that was the hardest part. Now let's test this in the browser. So if I hit play and it's working. Cool. Okay. Bum ba dum bum. Last step, and I saved something easy, the next and previous 30 buttons. We've already laid all the groundwork, so this part should go fast. On our backward 30 button, so let's scroll down, and here's our back 30 button. Let's add an on-click handler, and we want to call back 30. We're going to need to write that function, so let's come up here and say const back 30. Okay, first we want to add 30 seconds to our range slider, and it's already in seconds, so we can just say progress bar dot current dot value equals number. Number is a JavaScript function that will take any string and convert it to a number. So we're going to reference our progress bar dot current dot value, and we want to subtract 30. Then we want it to update everything just as we did when we changed the range slider. So let's call our change range function. If we look at that function real quick, just so we know exactly what's happening, it's updating the audio player based on the range slider, and then it's calling the change player current time, which updates the styles and our state. Okay, let's give this a spin in the browser. So I'm going to hit save, and let's give this a refresh. Okay, so I'm going to come forward, hit play, and it jumps. Perfect. Okay, now we want to do the same thing for our forward 30 button. Come back to our code, and on our forward 30 button, let's add an on-click event, and we'll say forward 30. Let's come up here and add a similar function. And I'm actually just going to copy and paste all of this, except instead of minus 30, we want plus 30. So if we open this within the browser and hit our forward 30 button, it's going to jump forward 30 seconds. Perfect. Awesome sauce. Okay. Dun, 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 dun. If you like this video and want to see more videos on web design and development, be sure to hit the subscribe button below. Hit the bell icon to receive notifications when new videos are posted. Until then, keep coding. As many of you may or may not know, I work for a company called Zeal, and they actually underwrite my channel. That's right. They wholeheartedly support what I'm doing on the YouTubes. Frankly, I don't know many companies that do that. In fact, most companies don't even want you to have side projects. And in my case, Zeal not only encourages it, they support it. Anyway, they're hiring. So if you're looking for a job, or even if you're not, but you want to work for a great company, plus you get to work with me, check out their website for the job listing. I'll include a link in the description below.